Welcome to the lecture on selection sizes. In this lecture, we will cover the concept of selections. This concept is based on the fact that when performing controlled testing, there are usually a lot of items that are testable, but it is not practical to test everything. As such, only a sample of items that are eligible for testing do get tested. So let's start with what is a selection. Simply put, according to the dictionary, a selection is a carefully chosen or representative collection of people or things, in this case, items or evidence for testing. Why do we make selections? As noted earlier, it's simply because it's not feasible to look at an entire population. Let's talk through an example. Say we have a control about obtaining supervisor approval prior to granting new users access. The test of operating effectiveness will be to check new users created and make sure approval was granted for each user. In order to identify the new users, we would run a system query as we discussed previously to determine the number of new users that were created during the audit period. And for a large organization, this can easily be in the hundreds. So this could be hundreds of individuals. If the number of new hires is, say, 200, 300, 500, it's not feasible or even reasonable to test all those users. In this case, it will be more practical to make a representative selection of those users and test those. By testing a representative sample of users, we can then extrapolate the conclusion of testing for the selection to the rest of the population. When selecting samples, you have to consider how frequently the control is performed and the risk of failure. This helps you to determine what an appropriate sample size selection should be. Most organizations have sample size guides that provide guidance and the number of samples to select based on the frequency of the control and the risk of failure. And I will show you a sample guide on the next slide. Finally, you also have to consider the range of variables in the population. What this means is that you should try to cover the entire audit period in your sample selection so it covers the entire range of variables. For example, if your audit period is from January to December, you want to make sure that you select samples that cut across the whole year as opposed to having samples that are skewed towards just some months of the year. So this means that sample size selection is not entirely random because it has to be a representative sample of the whole population of items. Let's look at a sample guide of selection sizes. In this particular guide, you would see here that the control frequency is on the left column, and then you have the risk of failure on the right two columns, lower and higher. So what this depicts is that for each control frequency, if based on the risk of failure, if it's a lower risk of failure or a higher risk of failure, you get to select the number of items that you would test. Let's look at weekly, for example. For a control that occurs weekly, if it has a lower risk of failure, you only need to select 5 items to test per this particular guide. However, if it has a higher risk of failure, then you would want to test at least 8. These numbers are just minimums. You can test at least 5 on the lower end of the risk of failure or 8 on the higher end of the risk of failure. It's not telling you the maximum, it's just the minimum number of items that need to be tested to give comfort that a representative sample has been tested. Check with your organization to see if they have a similar chart whenever you're performing testing. One thing to note is that if the nature of the control is sporadic and the control frequency cannot be clearly identified, you should determine the frequency using the entire population. So if the population is 12 items in total, then you can use the frequency of monthly. Or if you have about 52 items in the population, you want to use the frequency of weekly. However, if the population is between two control frequencies defined above, always use the higher frequency. So for example, if you have 25 items, then you don't want to use monthly, you want to use weekly because you're going to that next control frequency on the chart.